Everyone, and thank you for attending today's webinar, The State of Trade, Where Do Tariffs Come From? Before we begin, a few procedural points. At the end of the session, we're going to hold a Q&A as time allows. So you can ask questions through the Q&A function on the right of your screen. The questions that you ask will only be visible to you and to the Flexport team. We'll share a copy of the slide deck that we're going to be using at the end of the presentation, so you don't need to be vigorously scribbling notes, at least on what you see on the slides. All right, next, to make the lawyers happy, please keep in mind that all the information provided in this session is based on the situation at this current time and may not be customized to your specific business requirements. We always recommend reaching out to a Flexport expert to discuss your particular situation. All right, speaking of experts, well, I did that one too soon. I'm Phil Levy, I'm Chief Economist at Flexport, and the experts that I have with me are outstanding. I've got my colleague Tom Gould, who's one of those experts you had. He's Flexport's Vice President of Global Customs and Trade. Tom, hi.
Hi, Phil. Thanks for having me today.
Always a pleasure. These are both veterans we're going to be returning. We also are thrilled to have with us Ed Gresser, the Vice President and Director for Trade and Global Markets at the Progressive Policy Institute and longtime trade maven, Assistant USTR. There's a long list of accomplishments, but Ed, thank you for joining us.
Hi, thanks for the invite.
All right, so why are we talking about tariffs? We were chatting a little bit beforehand about how tariffs are like vinyl. Like vinyl records that, they once upon a time it was a really big thing. Everybody would talk about this. How do you handle tariffs? What kind of cartridge and record player do you have? Went completely out of fashion, and now they're back. So in a similar way, at least in the last 6 years, tariffs actually had a bit of a revival. They never went away. We can sort of trace it. They've been there. But the most straightforward ones had really been worked down over decades of negotiations following the Second World War. Now they're back with gusto. So we've got, your plain vanilla tariffs. We've got all kinds of swirling flavors. We're not going to focus as much here on the ebb and flow and the history of how all this stuff happened, but really rather on where did tariffs come from and how they work, the different guises in which they appear, and what businesses might do. So our first section, those that are put forward by Congress. In the US example, there's parallels in other countries. Something called administered tariffs, which function a little bit differently, but this is largely being descriptive. And then we're going to have a bit of what do we make of all of these, which we put under the heading, who pays? That may seem obvious, but there's some funny twists there in terms of who actually ends up paying tariffs. And in fact, that in itself was a subject of some debate as the US, particularly as the US started putting tariffs on China. We will have a section on dealing with tariffs. If you are in a business where you're facing these, something purchasing or something competitor is dealing with, what does one do? What are the options? How can one think about this? Then we'll get to, all right, we've had this revival. Is this something fleeting or is it something lasting? As I said, we will get to your question. Okay, as is our wont, we like to start off by asking what you all are seeing or thinking. So I would refer you to the poll where you've got a thing on the right. And so our opening question here is, how have tariffs affected you? Your options for answering this. They've always had a large effect on my business. They've never had a large effect on my business. It's been getting worse over the last few years. It's been getting better over the last few years. Or I keep meaning to do those calculations. Which for a while there actually was getting some good response. So no right answers, no wrong answers. We appreciate your participation. Want to see how you've been feeling about things. So at the moment, we have a pretty clear winner as the votes come pouring in. Actually, it's balancing off a little bit. And of course, there could be a little bit of a selection bias of who goes to a webinar on tariffs, those who are interested. But it's getting notably closer between getting worse over the last few years, but also always had a large effect on the business. Has been putting in a strong showing. So, Tom, you deal with a lot of people who are doing this. Is that about what you would have guessed? That I described this as, hey, tariffs faded away. We get a sizable chunk here, about a third, saying, no, it's always been a big deal.
Yeah, no, that is kind of what I would have expected. I'm kind of though reading between the lines a little bit and thinking that it may depend on the industry. For example, certain industries historically have had high tariffs. So apparel, footwear, a lot of retail industries have had high tariffs, and I would think that to them, the tariffs, yeah, they may be getting a little bit worse, but they've always been a big issue for those companies. But then you have other industries where tariffs have historically not been that high, where things are getting worse as far as they're concerned because they're getting higher with some of the newer tariffs that we're dealing with, like the Section 301 and 232 tariffs.
Yeah, no, very good point, and we're going to get to all of those things. So let's do that. Let's thank you to everyone who voted, and we'll be coming back to you with more polls. What we wanted to start out with were legislated tariffs, by which we mean in the U.S. at least, or in other places where it's, say, a parliament doing this. The good old-fashioned way of setting a tariff was Congress would vote. They would have a trade act of some sort. It's in the Constitution that it's Congress's power, Article 1, Section 8, to do this, to set these tariffs. And if we move ahead on the slides, we will see, there you go. Tom, what are we looking at here?
Thanks, Phil. We're looking at a page from the tariff schedule. So this is the HTS US, and this particular page happens to be a page out of the chapter that deals with footwear. And so this is what a page would look like, where me as a customs broker or your licensed customs broker would look at to determine the tariff classification, but also to determine a lot of other issues related to that. Related to the tariff classification number, like the duty rate, free trade agreements, and other aspects of regulations relating to trade.
I see a couple of columns. If we just take the sort of very first entry, there's a 15% or a 35%. Which is which? Why do we have two different rates on the same thing?
Well, so it helps to understand how we read the tariff. And if you'll notice that the descriptions are indented. So at the highest level, 6404, that's what we call the heading, tells us that everything in 6404 is footwear with outer soles of rubber, plastics, leather, or composition leather, and uppers of textile material. And then because we're reading indent to indent, what we realize is that each indent narrows the description that's above it. So that next indentation, where it's aligned with the number 640420, we call that a subheading, says footwear with outer soles of leather or composition leather. And so the heading 6404 includes footwear with different types of soles, but the 640420 is narrowed down to footwear with specific types of soles, meaning those soles with leather or composition leather. And then as we go further down, we see different breakouts based on value and based on the gender of that the shoe is designed for. And you'll also see different duty rates. And again, those duty rates in the rates of duty column tell us what the importer has to pay when they file their customs declaration at the time of import. There's other information on the page, like the unit of quantity, that tells us how we report the footwear, and footwear is reported in pairs, and that's what the PRS stands for there. And we have
Am I right in remembering that right column, that these are the Smoot-Hawley tariffs?
The column 2 rate, yeah, that's the tariff. Yes. It is basically the Smoot-Hawley tariffs. I don't recall. I believe that there have been some slight changes to it a little bit, but we as customs brokers refer to those as column 2 rates, and we don't really use them much. Today, they are only applied to imports from countries where we don't have normal MFN status with the country. So they apply if we were to import from Cuba, North Korea, Russia, or Belarus. So we sometimes see imports from there. It's rare, but that's the duty rate that would apply to those countries.
So just to give a little background for those out there who are not already completely steeped in trade arcana, Smoot-Hawley, this is the Trade Act of 1930, which came shortly before the Great Depression. What people have long arguments about causality, but but there was an enthusiasm about tariffs. What we're seeing now is not the first time. And these were things that Congress passed. These were sort of legislated tariffs where they would say, okay, footwear, here's what we want to do as tariffs, and they would apply these. What you said on MFN, these were the steady negotiations that we talked about. And we used two terms. We used MFN for most favored nation, which then got changed to normal trading relations. Because otherwise it made it sound like, some country that you were particularly fond of was actually your most favored nation.
Yeah.
And that was bad branding. So, but in each case, the idea was whomever you had struck the best deal with in the multilateral system, those are those general rates. And everybody got these. These are the things that came out of the multilateral system. Did I get that right?
Yep.
Okay, cool. Hey, Ed, I know we're going to get to your analysis later, but
Okay.
I can't help throwing this to you right now. Why would we want to break out? You look at these and they're shoes, right? There's different kinds. Why would you break out, something gets a 15% tariff and something gets a 37.5%?
Well, that's a good question and a good product to raise it for. Shoe tariffs are extremely high. In 2017, before we had the 301 tariffs, we got about $2.9 billion from shoe tariff revenue. Shoes made up about 0.1% of imports or something along those lines. So typically in the years both before Smoot-Hawley and afterwards, tariff system is extremely complicated. There's 11,414 lines, and each of them is the fossilized result of a lobbying campaign. In these cases dated to the 1960s and 70s and 1980s. And companies which did not feel very competitive and were worried about foreign competition would lobby to keep rates high or as high, close to the Smoot-Hawley rates as they could. And companies which felt either very competitive or felt that they weren't that worried about competition, that they're making very elite luxury goods, would not be so worried about it. And so we've wound up with a very broad diversity of tariff rates, going from 0% for quite a lot of goods up to a peak of 48% for another kind of sneaker. And each one has its own little lobbying story behind it, and most of them are from our grandparents' era.
Yeah. So, one way one could think about the tariffs that people end up facing, those that came through this legislative route, it's almost like, sculpting, where you start out with a big block, and the big block was, you did the block too. It was the Smoot-Hawley, and then you carve away. And so we had all these agreements that carved away certain things, except as you said, Ed, if there are certain things that were more resistant, and they stayed prominent. Because they didn't get carved away through these repeated rounds. I would note those repeated rounds of negotiations, there were two broad categories. There were the sort of multilateral ones, which we had the GATT and the World Trade Organization, ultimately. Haven't done that for a while. But even those all counted as legislated tariffs because in the end, you'd strike a deal with these other countries, but the U.S. retained sovereignty. So that in the end, it needed to be that there was an implementing package that would go before the Congress, and the Congress would vote on the implementing package, and that's where the tariffs would come from, and that's where we'd get this different line. The specials there, we're going to get to that in a moment, but these are the things that have gotten a lot of attention, which is the free trade agreement that we talked about. Let's go to the next slide. One of the ways we can sort of characterize and talk about this, and Ed sort of giving us some hints on this, it'd be great to have like a single measure of, well, how high are tariffs? And we'll give you a few different ones. Here's part of why it's challenging, because how do you weight it if you have a really high tariff on a very small category? Well, you could say, well, that shouldn't get as much weight. So you can do things like saying, I'm going to weight these categories, and Tom just showed us how they can, and talked about how they get down into very precise subcategories. We're going to weight them by how much trade takes place. That would seem like an easy answer for giving the weights. Problem is, if you get a very, very high tariff, we call it a prohibitive tariff, you get no trade, in which case it gets no weight. So I don't think there's a single perfect solution. Ed, do you have a favorite for, how high are tariffs when you're looking at a country?
At the moment, at least for the United States, I'm tending to look at the trade-weighted average because the legislated tariffs we're talking about now, that's in terms of tariff revenue, it's about half of our tariff system. The other half is from the Trump administration's administered tariffs. So I think the simple average across the 11,000 some tariff lines no longer really describes the actual tariff system very well. As you say, there are problems with any way to measure it, but I think you could say generally U.S. tariffs by simple average come to about 3.5%. By trade weighted, it's more like 3% now.
Okay, that's good. They give us a broad idea. And then a chart like this shows the cross section where you can see some of the variation across them. Let's go to the next slide if we can. And then we'll get back to that sort of middle column that we talked about very quickly, which is these were the ones where it sort of said free, and then it had the two-letter things. This was a whole series of trade deals, sometimes bilateral, Israel early on, sometimes sort of much broader, where you had a whole bunch of countries involved. We don't see on here things like the TPP, which was an attempt to pull some of these together and to broaden it, but these have been some also in terms of topic coverage. There were the full-fledged ones, which were supposed to be substantially all trade, and then you got to things like the Japan Critical Minerals Agreement. I would say on both of that. On both the WTO rounds, and we see the WTO thing there in 1995, and in terms of these agreements, there has been a substantial slowing in recent years of what we've done. Ed, what is your take on that?
I agree entirely. There has been a substantial slowing in what the U.S. has done. As you're showing here, the last really new agreements were 2012, and those are Korea, Panama, Colombia, and Peru. USMCA is a partial and in some ways significant renegotiation of the NAFTA from 1994. Yes, that has slowed down quite a bit. Elsewhere in the world, these things continue to happen. There's a lot of activity with the expansion of the TPP, which is in effect, even though the U.S. isn't part of it. China is doing a lot of agreements. Europe is trying to do a lot of agreements. So the U.S. is a little bit of an exception to a general pattern right now.
Okay, good. So that's where we are. We've got this schedule that Congress was supposed to put in. They've revised them when the administration went and negotiated these agreements. I should note that some of that going and negotiating involved delegation, in the sense that it wasn't, the Ways and Means Committee going over to Geneva to negotiate these things. They would give some authority to something like Trade Promotion Authority to the U.S. Trade Representative's Office, to the executive branch, that under certain conditions they could go negotiate these things, but Congress would, in the end, get to vote and to say whether or not it wanted to adopt this. That is meant as a segue to our next topic, which is administered tariffs. So many of the tariffs that you all might be seeing out there actually have something of a different origin. They all started with Congress in a sense, because if you take something like anti-dumping, and I'll say a bit about this, we could do a whole webinar on anti-dumping, so we won't delve as deeply as we might. But essentially, there are agreed upon rules at the WTO for where one can do this. So they have to follow certain procedures. Congress writes those into law and says this is how anti-dumping is supposed to work. But then the actual implementation, the sort of reviewing of cases, and in the end, the application of tariffs or duties, this does not involve Congress. There's no final congressional stage where they have to vote on these things. This is, in the case of anti-dumping, you've got the Commerce Department and you've got the International Trade Commission, who go back and forth with preliminary and final rulings. But we get now, that's for anti-dumping. There's other things, and we've seen this recently, where you get substantially more executive branch discretion. So let's just go down the list a little bit. I'll sort of say what's out there. We've got some numbers from the WTO. Note that these are not all U.S. numbers, but it's because the WTO is tracking some things. Anti-dumping is supposed to be sales at less than fair value. Ask me what is less than fair value. There's the rub. There's a long story in that, and that people argue about that substantially. But if you find a dumping margin, the fairly simple thing that emerges from this is a tariff gets imposed on a country because of that dumping margin. Countervailing duty is fairly similar, but it has to do with a subsidy going on. Then we get to the ones that are a little bit different. One that I don't think has been taken up quite as much recently is escape clause or safeguard actions, which the first two, anti-dumping and countervailing duty, were a broad presumption. Somebody did something a little bit wrong. You either sold it less than fair value, you stuck on a subsidy that you weren't supposed to. Escape clause doesn't necessarily have that. It says, there was market disruption. The exact rules can vary, but we can stick on a tariff. It doesn't have to be a tariff in this case. I got that right, didn't I, Tom? That it doesn't have to be a tariff on the escape clause?
Right, it doesn't have to be a tariff. It often is, but it doesn't have to be.
Yeah, and so it could be due to a tariff, but it could also be something else. But the idea is sort of an adjustment period that they will go. Before I get to the other ones, I'm going to let my very knowledgeable colleagues weigh in. Ed, let me start with you for a second. How do you think of the relative importance? And let's go before some of the recent 232, 301 actions. We'll get to those in a second. How do you think about the relative importance of this administered protection with things like anti-dumping, countervailing duties relative to the legislated stuff that we just talked about, which you told us had something like a 3.5% average?
It's kind of selective. I looked up this morning, Commerce Department website. They administer the anti-dumping and the countervailing duty laws. They say right now, which is a little bit after your WTO data, there's 670 of those penalties enforced in the U.S. So the U.S. is a pretty enthusiastic user of those things. Joining India, I think, is the heaviest user. However, they are very concentrated in a small number of products. Steel products in particular, I think, are somewhat more than half of all of our anti-dumping and countervailing duties. So in the world of metals and steel especially, and to a lesser extent in a few things like chemicals, they're quite important. In the world of consumer goods, in the world of energy, no, you don't see them hardly at all.
Tom, what has your experience been in terms of dealing with various types of duties?
So when I look at the anti-dumping and the countervailing duties, one of the things that it makes a very much a challenge for a customs broker is the retrospective aspect of the anti-dumping and countervailing duties in the U.S. In other words, in the U.S., we apply those margins that you mentioned, and we apply the tariffs to adjust those margins on past transactions. Most other countries around the world apply the anti-dumping and countervailing duties on future transactions. And so what we have is a situation where companies are often caught by surprise, where tariffs are applied on products that they imported last year or even longer ago than that. And I think that that's one of the challenges that we see with the anti-dumping and countervailing duties, is that surprise aspect. The escape clause or the safeguard section 201 tariffs are a little bit different in that those are applied on future transactions and they're very narrow in scope. The anti-dumping and countervailing transactions apply to a very broad range of products within that industry, but the safeguard tariffs and the current ones that we're dealing with today for the section 201 have deal with residential washing machines is one, and another one is on solar panels. So they're easier for us as a customs broker to understand and to ensure that we're applying the tariffs the right way.
So given that retrospective nature, is there a way for a company to sort of understand their risks?
Very difficult. It's very difficult. I don't know, 4 or 5 years ago, there was a case having to do with granite countertops. And I know of companies that, for example, a company that put granite countertops in like hotels, and they got duty bills that put companies out of business after the fact, after they'd already installed their granite countertops in the hotels. The case came out, and because it applied to past transactions, these are situations where companies had already not only sold the products, but they were installed, and now they're getting a duty bill that they hadn't expected. So they can be very devastating on certain industries.
And we spent a moment on the legislative tariffs, talking about where the levels came from. It's a bit different in the anti-dumping and the countervailing duty. There are prescribed calculations that said, okay, what is fair value, how far below? But those calculations, particularly if you are dealing with, say, a non-market economy, can involve a lot of interesting suppositions and substitutions where you put in numbers, and sometimes you get very large duties coming out of these things, and they tend to show up particularly in the sort of with non-market economies, which is one reason why you'll get trading partners very eager to be labeled as a market economy, because it puts some limits on that.
And because they do involve a fairly sophisticated analysis, there's often litigation on those, which drags the time period out. So there's a long period of uncertainty where we don't really know what the rate is going to be, and so companies have to, include that in their risk analysis when they're deciding, how and when to import those products.
Yeah, and that's a good point on the timing. When the legislative stuff that we started before, when Congress sets that, it's there until Congress changes it, does a free trade agreement, whatever. These, for the most part, they have reviews, right? There'll be regularly scheduled things that we talked about, but there's not an automatic expiration, is there, or did I miss some?
Well, there's sunset reviews. There's required time periods where there have to be reviews, and if certain things don't happen, it's possible that those can go away. But generally, the industries that initiate the petitions are on top of those, and they continue to provide information to the Department of Commerce and the International Trade Administration to demonstrate that there still is harm, and so we often see a continuation. But we sometimes see that the numbers adjust, right? It could be that there's still harm that's found, but the amount of harm changes. Therefore, the anti-dumping or the countervailing duty rates could change over time.
Yeah. Now, the reason I paused in the middle of this list is if we had been having this discussion in the 80s, 90s, 2000s, early 2010s, those would have been the administered protection things that would have predominated, that we would mostly be talking about.
Yes.
The latter two really emerged. They were on the books. I think Section 232 is from a trade law of the 1960s. So they'd been on the books for a long time. They just hadn't been used very much. I won't say never, there had been, but it was very lightly used. And then two of the things we saw during the Trump administration, prominent sources of tariffs coming from the executive branch, Section 232 used the authority given to the president in the case of national security concerns to apply tariffs. And what we saw were in steel and aluminum, especially, I think that was really the case, that against a whole broad range of countries, that the U.S. was able to apply tariffs, I think often 25% tariffs. Ed, what's your thought both about the level and how those are, whether those are or not national security concerns?
Again, in terms of the level, there's a 10% tariff on aluminum and a 25% tariff on steel. There are exceptions, for example, for Mexico and Canada as free trade agreement countries and so forth. Altogether, I think it's about $3 billion a year, as against the earlier legislated tariff system was about $32 billion. National security is, it's in the eye of the beholder. It's hard to define it very objectively. I do think there are some problems with the way this has worked out. If you go back to the report that the Commerce Department did, for example, on steel, what they said at the time was that U.S. steel capacity utilization was about 75%. In order to have a long-term viable steel industry, it should be 82 or 83%. And this level of tariff combined with a kind of aggressive infrastructure program would allow the steel industry to reach that threshold. If you look at the patterns today, you see before the 232, we were putting out about 82 million tons of steel a year. We are continuing to put out about 82 million tons of steel a year. Capacity utilization has not gone up to that level. So to some extent, I would think that there's been some deterrent to importing. On the other hand, U.S. share of the U.S. market has gone up. On the other hand, U.S. exports of steel have dropped. And relative to the economy, the use of steel has declined a bit. So the effect of having higher steel costs and somewhat less diversity of supply seems to have offset the import reduction that the Trump administration was looking for. So it doesn't seem to me like the situation on the ground has changed all that much, and therefore the degree of security in terms of scale and health of the steel industry doesn't seem to have changed all that much. So it doesn't seem to me like this has really met the goals that the Trump administration's Commerce Department set up when it was explaining what it wanted to do and why.
Yeah, that's a good point. And I want to come back to you in just 1 second, but I want to bring 301 into the discussion. 301 is sort of a broader clause which says the president can investigate and do things about trade problems, which could result in fairly innocuous stuff where, okay, we will go and we'll initiate negotiations with the country that we think has done us wrong. Or it could be tariffs. And what we've seen in the case of the US and the People's Republic of China, this has ended up being a substantial level of tariffs. And you're welcome to comment on that. The other point that I wanted to get you to comment in particular on, though, is we started this out with like, here's almighty Congress, Article 1, Section 8 doing stuff. And by the end, we're getting the president applying tariffs as he sees fit. Is this just, random that this happened, or do you see that there's been a sort of shift in the locus of power over tariffs and where tariffs?
Rather the latter. Before turning to that, just a bit of numbers. In Section 301 tariffs on China have been very, very large and made a very big change in U.S. tariffs as part of the tax system. In 2017, we had $33 billion in tariff revenue. Last year, we had $90 billion. So the 232 tariff on metals is significant in metals, and it's raised a bit of money on imported metals. The 301 has basically doubled the size of the tariff system. So it's allowed an administration to kind of create an entire parallel tariff system that didn't exist before. And your mention of Article 1, Section 8 is, I think, the power of Congress to regulate commerce with foreign nations. Congress also has a power which I feel is more important, which is the power to impose taxes, duties, excises, and imposts. And what this experience has shown is that both Section 232 and 301 are written in a way that allows a president to bypass that congressional tax authority and create a parallel tax system, which is as large as the regular tariff system. And I think that's constitutionally, that's quite consequential.
That's an interesting point. It certainly, Tom, you've had some involvement in terms of, and we're going to I know I'm jumping ahead a little bit because we're going to get to remedies in a bit, but does this affect the broad ability of companies to do something? It's clearly got to be a little bit different trying to persuade Congress on something than it is to persuade the executive branch.
Yeah, to me, I think the interesting thing was that when the tariffs were imposed, there was this thought that companies would pick up and move their supply chains out of China. But what they realized was that was difficult, and it was difficult especially in a short period of time. But as now these tariffs have been around for almost 5 years, we actually have seen that happen. And we actually have seen companies pick up either their supply chain or parts of their supply chain simply to move them out of China to avoid the Section 301 tariffs. We've gotten to the point where companies can justify the cost of moving because of the Section 301 tariffs are included in part of the calculation of not moving their supply chains.
Yeah, so you raise a very good point, which is that one of the what the really important differences between these tariffs and the ones we were talking about earlier. The ones we were talking about earlier, for the most part, tended to be fairly uniform, as you talked about, just a couple of exceptions. But mostly it was that Schedule 1, general duty, with the exception of free trade agreements. Here, the section, certainly the 301 and the anti-dumping countervailing duty, tend to be against very specific countries. So if you are importing and the goods, coming from China, that's one duty. If it's coming from Vietnam, that particular duty does not apply. Unless, it might in an anti-dumping suit where they were both hit with anti-dumping charges, but unless it is specifically named, it doesn't apply.
Right, and that's why country of origin has become much more of an important concept for companies to understand and to be able to determine. Country of origin is a concept that each country defines itself. So in the U.S., we have one way of determining country of origin, but other countries have different ways. And as a matter of fact, here in the U.S., we actually have multiple ways of determining country of origin depending on the purpose of the country of origin. Are we determining country of origin for a free trade agreement versus are we determining country of origin for simple reporting purposes and understanding whether or not the Section 301 duties apply to the products?
And the challenge here, of course, is that while in econ classes it's easy to pretend that goods are all made in a single country or a single place,
right?
In reality, you could be bringing parts in from all over the place, and so it's 10% from here and 18% from there, and then it's finished in another place, and then you get to exactly the question that you just posed, which is, all right, so what is the country of origin?
Exactly. Most products,
Is there a shorthand answer to that? Is it final transformation, or does it vary by product?
In the U.S., the basic country of origin rules are based on what we call substantial transformation, and that's where a product changes its name, character, or use to another product in a country, and that's the basic way we look at determining the country of origin. But like I said, that's for determining the country of origin for things like marking, like what the label needs to say on the product, what the country of origin is that we declare to customs, and that's the country of origin that's used for the Section 301 and 232 tariffs. If we're looking at determining if a product qualifies for a free trade agreement, we have a different set of rules that are based on what we call tariff shift and regional value content. So one of the odd things that have happened is some companies have moved their production out of China, have moved it to a free trade agreement country, have been able to take advantage of the duty-free status from that country, but because the substantial transformation rules say that the product did not transform substantially, you may have a situation where the China tariffs apply, but the company can take advantage of a free trade agreement like USMCA and not pay the normal MFN duty rate, but they have to still pay the Section 301 duty. It gets really complicated.
Yeah, the stuff for experts. Ed, did you have a comment in there?
Yeah, I was just going to say you do see a shift in import patterns. We had before the 301, I believe it was about 21% of imports of goods were from China. And then last year it was about 17, and this year it's dipped down. You can definitely see smartphones coming more from Vietnam and TVs coming more from Mexico and some other products coming from India that used to be Chinese. So I think the 301 has combined with a lot of dissatisfaction with China's own policies, some of its COVID policies, some of its government's attitude toward foreign investors generally. So there's been several factors combining to make China, I think, less attractive than it used to be.
And of course, we also had a significant demographic change going on in the background over time with things with China's labor force and the like. All right, lots of good stuff. We want to go on. We're due for another poll, I believe. So we're going to talk a little bit more about what's behind all these things and how we think about them and analyze them. But first, we want to get your opinion just on the basics of why do we have tariffs? So here are your choices: raising revenue, punishing other countries, protecting key industries, defending labor, or historical accident. So I'll give you a moment to think that over. Some choices there. Actually, we're making you take a stand on it, so we didn't even offer an easy out. But let's see those votes. Let's take your best guess. So far, we have protecting key industries in the lead, so political economy mavens. And we're also going to, I should clarify, we want you to think about, well, I allowed for historical accident being the reasons may have changed over time, but where are we now? All right, so I think at the moment, still pending some late surges, we have a clear winner on this, which is protecting key industry. Ed, I would guess that you'd agree with that.
Up to a point, I would say, if you look at the tariff system, the permanent MFN tariff system, I think you would say the reasons we have much higher tariffs on clothing and on dairy products and on orange juice and on shoes reflect the lobbying skill of those industries, especially 50 and 60 years ago. The reason we have most of our anti-dumping penalties on steel and the 232 tariffs on steel and aluminum, I think that is the government's judgment on key industries where we want to limit import competition. But there's also a lot of historical accident. I mean, a lot of the very high tariff products that live on for decades and centuries are no longer made in the U.S. at all. Like 37%, 37.5% tariff on shoes you saw, that's not made here. That's a relic of the Smoot-Hawley Act and a lobbying campaign in the 1970s to prevent tariff cuts on shoes. Industry, at least in that slice of it, no longer exists here, and it's sort of historical accident that keeps carrying on year after year.
Yeah, and by the way, first, thank you for everybody who voted on that. We appreciate the input. Let's go to the next slide, and I think this is showing you've actually done. I think we had. Hold on, I thought we had stuff on. Yeah, that's right. Okay, so I want to get to Ed's stuff in a second. We've already made reference to this one, which is sort of what's happening to overall customs duties, how much revenue is the government bringing in. I would also note that I wasn't including that raising revenue as just sort of a throwaway. I think in a lot of countries, that was the main thing coming in. It was a lot easier, say like in a developing country, a lot easier to collect the revenue at a port than it was to sort of have an income tax system, which required a lot of information and stuff disseminated throughout a country. Probably less so for the US. Let's go on to the next slide, please. And so, Ed, you have done a lot of research on many things, but one of the things that I've found sort of most captivating is that you've sort of shown some of the differences and found patterns in where we see tariffs. Can you tell us a bit about this? You can also call for whatever slides you like, but when you look at the patterns to these things, you just described some historical, some lobbying. What is the net outcome when you analyze?
I think if you look overall at the tariff system, and to oversimplify it, natural resource goods like energy, fisheries, minerals, almost all zero tariff. Very sophisticated technological products, medicines, IT goods, computers, satellites, aircraft, also zero tariff. Heavy industry things like cars, 2.5%, those are kind of low tariff. Consumer goods, very high tariff. Those are legacies of the 19th century, really. The Industrial Revolution industries always wanted high tariff protection. They got it. They got it as early as 1816, and it has traveled on through the U.S. System ever since. It reached kind of a peak between 1890 and 1930. Then when the U.S. began negotiating with foreign countries in the 1940s, they were typically exempted, put a lot of work into avoiding tariff cuts. This was particularly true for luxury products. I think we'll see that in a second. And so what we've been left with, this is before the 232 and 301, is a small set of consumer goods, the average tariff around 11%. Everything else was 0.7%. So almost a zero tariff policy for everything else. Then this is a look at a finer detailed look at consumer goods tariffs. And here you can see what I think this is really a scandal of American tax policy. Within consumer goods, almost everything that's a luxury product is very lightly taxed. Everything that's a mass market product is very heavily taxed. So you look at men's shirts, if it's silk, it's 0.9%, 19.7% if it's cotton, 32% for polyester. A spoon is 3.3% if it's made out of sterling silver, 14% if it's very cheap stainless steel. And this is not cherry-picked, it's quite systematic. There's good academic work that has tried to look at this system as a whole and really sees this by far the most regressive part of the US tax system. And over time, many of the mass market products would have been big job supporters 50 or 60 years ago. Very few, if any of them, are now. So it is a kind of sad commentary on the lack of interest in the system and how it was evolving over the last century into really quite an obnoxious way to tax low-income people, especially with children, and avoid taxing rich people for buying very similar products.
So Ed, you had a different set of government agencies that you worked at than I did. One of my early formative memories when I was first working at the Council of Economic Advisors and getting into some interagency discussions was I was sort of just working on my economics degree, and so I knew you thought about things like consumer interests. You'd kind of get laughed out of the room if you brought up consumer interests. Did you have a different experience when you were at USTR?
On the whole, it wouldn't come up. I mean, USTR, it's a government's trade negotiating agency. Not meant to be a very reflective agency. It's sort of they're supposed to have a tip of the spear mentality. President wants this, go after it. Congress is telling you do this, try to get it for them. And one of the facts about tariff life is that the people who pay for it really don't know very much about it. Like an analogy I would use is the sales tax we have in Maryland, where I live. There are 4 different sales tax rates. There's 6% for most things. There's a couple of rates for auto vehicles, and there's a 9% for alcoholic beverages. And those are all printed on all the receipts you get. Tariff system, 11,414 lines. Very few people know what's in them. Most of the contact the government, or at least the trade negotiators were getting, was exporters who want access to foreign markets and import competing businesses and labor unions who want to avoid cutting tariffs that are important to them. And government negotiators over 4 generations were really trying to listen, and they should have been listening to also to people in the Council of Economic Advisors who are thinking about the efficiency of the economy and the equity or inequity of the tariff system. I would say this is not a U.S. problem. Ours is different and worse than other countries in some ways. It's less heavy on taxation of food, though. But almost everywhere in the world, tariffs are a very regressive form of taxation. And people in the U.S. system 200 years ago were complaining about this. Like, there's a great article by the 4th Treasury Secretary, Albert Gallatin, who looks at tariff law and says almost everything in this is meant to limit the taxation of rich people and maximize the taxation of poor people. And I think that's because tariffs are so opaque and hard to see for the public in general, but much easier to see for businesses and wealthy people. who want to minimize the burdens on themselves. And it is a systematic problem for the world and not only for the United States.
Yeah. Let's go to the next slide as we sort of talk about this. We got too much good stuff to talk about and not enough time. So I would I headlined this section, who pays. So one of your arguments there was the people who are paying were often people who are at lower income levels, presumably the ones not consuming luxury goods and consuming more of mass market. What is the gender story?
The gender story is something I don't think I understand quite as well, but the clothing, there's two chapters for clothing, 61 and 62, and they are divided by gender in the different subheadings. So there are two headings for men's underwear and 3 for women's underwear. There's a heading for women's suits and ensembles and women's shirts, and there's headings for men's. And the tariffs in general are higher on women's goods, about 3%. The ITC did a look at this, International Trade Commission, a few years ago, and found it's extracting about probably $1.5 billion from women each year because of this differential. I was once told that this is also the result of lobbying campaigns, really in the 70s and 80s, that women's clothing was a little bit more labor intensive. There were more frills and more buttons things. And that meant that the makers of women's clothes worked a little bit harder to preserve higher tariffs. So the men's clothing rates got cut over those years a bit more than women's. But it is right now, as far as I know, the only U.S. tax that imposes different rates on men's and women's goods and has higher taxes on one than the other.
So it's interesting to know that, I don't know, about 10 years ago or so, there was a lawsuit brought by, I think it was Totes Isotoner. Basically, it was a gender-based discrimination lawsuit that was brought in the Court of International Trade on this specific topic. It didn't end up going anywhere, but I know a number of companies kind of joined in on the lawsuit, but ultimately it didn't end up going anywhere. But there have been lots of discussions on that. And the interesting thing when you dig into the details, I think overall, Ed is right that in general, women's tariffs on women's clothing tend to be higher than men's, but it's not always the case. There are some situations where there's certain men's items that are have a higher tariff rate than women's, and there's really, in looking at it, there doesn't seem to be any rhyme or reason as to why one is higher than the other when we dig into the specifics.
Yeah.
Now there was not a plot against women. I'd use the analogy from chemistry of Brownian motion. There's random effects of lots of little atoms moving around and banging into each other, and that
yes.
In the world of lobbying, that's how this has worked out, and each line has been negotiated separately without a lot of thinking about how it would look when you brought them all together.
Oh, that's interesting. All right, that's very cool, interesting perspective of this. Let's move on because we've got there's a question which ought to be kind of fundamental, and we get a little bit practical, which is who pays the tariffs? Tom, if we take this literally, who pays the tariff?
Interesting. To me, it's a simple question. It's the importer of record, the company who filed the declaration with customs for the products that are imported. Now, practically, in many cases, it's the customs broker that pays it on behalf of the importer, and then the customs broker will invoice the importer for the tariffs that were paid along with their services. In many cases, especially with larger companies, they've set up accounts where they can pay directly, in which case when the broker files the declaration, they tell the government which account to pull the money out of. But to me, it's simple. The importer pays the tariffs.
Yeah, and economists argue on this stuff. And the reason they argue is, so economists will get into this question of incidence, which normally is an abstract thing that you put on a midterm exam, but it actually got to be a fairly significant subject of debate when we got to those Section 301 tariffs that we talked about before, because the question was, you stick on the substantial amount of tariffs on China, and is China paying those, or is the US paying those? And I won't walk through the whole graph here. It turns out that the key to this is how much do prices move? That effectively, if you stick tariffs on China and Chinese prices drop by the amount of the tariff, you could say that effectively they're paying them. And it has nothing to do with customs brokers and who actually turns over the money because the prices are shifting. Whereas if let's say the Chinese price stayed constant, and what you saw was an increase in the prices paid by US domestic consumers, then economists would conclude that the incidence was on US consumers, that they were the ones who actually paid the tariffs. One of the surprising results, I quote one of the studies here, but there's more than one, was I think the expectation prior to the imposition of the 301 tariffs was you could get a degree of split. It was something of a surprise that it ended up looking a lot more like than even some of the authors of these studies had once predicted, that a lot more fell on the U.S. Than they had previously thought. And was that your reading of the literature?
Yes, very much so.
So we end up with, so you may tell somebody else, hey, you've got to pay this. It pushes prices around as we do it. All right, let's move on, because there's something which I know we've been getting questions on, and so let's group these all into dealing with tariffs. Actually, Tom, I'm going to turn to you. Give me a couple principles, and maybe especially say something about exemption. What does one do with exemption?
So the way that specifically like the Section 232 and the 301 tariffs, the way that they were designed was there was the ability for companies or industries to apply for exemptions based on certain rules. Generally, the rules were that a product was critical, or there was no competition from the U.S., but there are certain rules that can be followed to apply for an exemption. Now, the exemptions tend to be very product specific. So we might look at a product based on its classification. The additional tariff might apply to a product based on the HTS. So everything that's classified in that HTS would be subject to the additional tariffs. But often with the exemptions only apply to a small subset of products that are classified within that provision. One of the examples that I think of is there's a Section 301 tariff on water pumps, but there's an exception for water pumps that pump, I don't remember, it is less or more than a certain amount of water, so many gallons per minute. And so it may be that you have two products that are classified in the same HTS classification provision, but one is subject to the tariffs and the other one is eligible for an exception.
Yeah. Okay. And how does, if somebody wants to do this, what they think they need an exemption, what do they do?
Well, there are different processes. The Section 301 tariffs right now, there's no opening for filing for new exemptions. Right? There was a period of time where companies or industries could submit petitions to the U.S. Trade Representative, and the U.S. Trade Representative would look at those and decide which products they wanted to grant exemptions to. Today, if your product fits within the definition of the exemption, you qualify for it. But if your product doesn't, there's no option to get a new exemption. There has been talk about opening up a new round of exemptions. A lot of the exemptions are due to expire. I think it's the end of next month. And so there's also discussions about the potential to extend some of those exemptions. But those are all things that are political in nature, and really we're waiting for either the administration or Congress to act on them.
Okay, we have right at our time, but I want to close with sort of a speed round. Quick answer from each of you. I sort of cast this earlier as we've gone through this revival phase of tariffs. Do you see this as, okay, this phase is coming to a close and we're going to get back to more liberalized stuff, or this phase is with us for a while? Tom, quick answer from you.
I think it's with us for a while, and I think it's going to just get more complex as time goes on.
Okay, so we all need customs brokers. Ed, quick answer from you.
Basically concur. It's a big choice next year. The Biden administration is sort of standing pat, and in fact, the National Security Council has said tariffs are not a core part of economic policy, and trade is not a core part of international economic policy. So they're trying to keep this issue kind of quiet. Trump candidacy, or Trump administration were to return, has proposed breaking off ties with China and having a global tariff of 10% added on top of what's already there. So the situation may change, but it's probably not liberalizing very soon.
Okay, well, a bit of a grim outlook, but I think accurate, actually, which is what we care about. So thank you both very much for sharing your expertise. We are out of time, although certainly not out of interesting things to talk about. So, but very much appreciate you, Tom and Ed, for this. Appreciate you, our audience, for attending today's session. We will email out the links to the slides and links to the we'll email the slides, links to the recording tomorrow morning. There will also be a short feedback survey presented when you log off this call. Please take a moment to share your thoughts and feedback with the team so we can continue to curate great content for you. Thank you all and have a great day.